Thank you, everyone, for attending and for your interest in our event that we titled Kazakhstan's Bloody January, Protest Motivations, Public Perceptions, and Human Rights. My name is Karlagasha Kabatova. I'm a program associate at the Central Asia program here at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. I will moderate our discussion today, and we organized this event together with PaperLab Research Center based in Astana, Kazakhstan. PaperLab focuses mostly on public policy research, and they publish their studies in open access on their website. Before we begin, I'd like to provide a short chronology of the events that are known as Qandı Qantar, or Bloody January. So on the 2nd of January 2022, in Mangystau region, city of Zhanaozian, hundreds of people started protesting against doubling of prices for liquefied gas from 60 tenge to 120 per liter. Protests in other parts of Mangystau followed. Protests in Almaty, Aktobe, Atyrau, and Shymkent started as well. On January 4th, the government announced that the demands to reduce the prices to 50 tenge will be satisfied, but protests didn't stop and political demands started being made. By night, police in Almaty started using tear gas, stun grenades, and rubber bullets against protesters. President Tokayev introduced the state of emergency in Almaty and in Mangystau region. On January 5th, shooting started in Almaty and the Akimat was burned down by unknown people. The prosecutor's office building was damaged, and the building where a lot of news TV channels based was attacked and equipment was destroyed. Police, military, medical personnel were being attacked. Massive looting started. The state of emergency was introduced nationwide. On January 6th, news about casualties started appearing. The internet was blocked in the country and only a couple state TV channels worked. The CSTO troops came to Kazakhstan on a so-called peacemaking mission. And on January 7th, President Tokayev said the country was attacked by 20,000 terrorists and ordered security forces to shoot to kill without warning. The counter-terrorist operation was in full force. On January 11th, the president announced that the situation was finally under control. Officially, 238 people died during the events and thousands were injured. And again, this was just a very superficial chronology of a lot of other things happened. And now I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Aldiyar Auyezbek, a research fellow at PaperLab, specializing in researching economy and social perceptions in Kazakhstan and in Central Asia. Aldiyar was the main researcher on the study, in the study about people's perceptions of the January events, and the link to that event, to that report is on our website. The second speaker is Kamila Kavyazina, a sociology and public policy researcher with 12 years of experience working in several think tanks. Kamila will talk about their other research, where they interviewed protesters and other participants of the January events. After that, we'll hear from Serik Bisimbayev, director and co-founder of PaperLab. He will provide some reflections and conclusions. And the last, but of course not least, speaker is Yevgeniy Zhovtis, the director of the Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights, the oldest and largest civil society organization in Kazakhstan. Mr. Zhovtis will talk about labor and social rights violations in the Mangystau region, where the protests began, and human rights issues during the investigations of the events. So without further ado, let's listen to our speakers. So that we have enough time for questions from the audience, I kindly ask each speaker to speak for 10 minutes maximum. And Aldiyar, the floor is yours.
So thank you, everyone. Let me share the screen first of all. So, is that good?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, we want to study from the telephone survey that we have conducted a year later. It was a meta survey about the perceptions of the event of January 2022. And to make it short, methodology we conducted in 2 months, a year after the events, in December, January of this year. It actually covered all regions of Kazakhstan, and it was conducted through a random telephone survey. So we have generated some random numbers. Most of them actually didn't exist, and In the final, we had 1,047 respondents. We asked them 12 questions in both Kazakh and Russian languages, which were the most convenient for them. And we need to mention that our donor was Konrad Adenauer's think tank and partners Demoscope, or in otherwise known as MediaNet journal. So what we have, we have asked them. First of all, we asked what do they think actually happened during those events, and we see from this slide that there are actually no dominant option, because there are like only 38% is the first one. So people still argue and have doubts about what happened actually, and there are some competition among those versions of events. The first one, political provocation to seize power, the most, I would say, popular option that our respondents mentioned. And actually, it aligns with the official results, like an official version of the event said by the government year later. And the second option is about peaceful protests that actually, in some places, in some cities like Almaty, turned into riots and looting. The third option is that it was attacked by terrorists, 15%. And actually, we have that we have known that this scenario, this event, this version was said during the event, like the first days. For instance, when President Tokayev mentioned that actually there are some foreign terrorists coming into country and wanting to destabilize the situation here. Last, you see the last column, hard to answer, don't know, and actually it has quite a big number. 16% of people didn't know what to answer still a year later. And so what it shows us in general, there are actually no consensus on the events, even a year later. And I personally believe that still like almost 2 years later, we like among population, there is still no kind of agreement on that matters. Also, what's interesting, but I won't stop to late on this, we have some differences on social demographic side. So, for instance, people who believe that it was political provocation, there are more older people, there are more Russian ethnic citizens of Kazakhstan, there are more urban citizens among them. And on the opposite side, the actually Kazakh-speaking people less tend to believe that it was political provocation. They actually more keen that it was peaceful protests. So another question that we have asked our respondents, what do you feel about those events when you remember them a year later? And we see that the most prominent two options are fear, anxiety, and pity. And it's kind of interesting because even a year later, when actually the government has achieved stabilization of the country, a lot, like a third of the people still experience the fear and anxiety. They are kind of not in the, let's say, maybe peaceful place to live through these events. Other options are also prominent, like sadness, resentment, disappointment, injustice, and all of them are kind of not, I'd say, not show that there are still a lot of kind of emotional things around those events. And another question that we have asked, during those events, like few days that happened, government has made several serious decisions and made some actions. And there, among the population, have quite like different rate of approval. For instance, governors, like in Kazakh, it's Akims, have the highest like percentage of approval when they go to public. They try to negotiate and communicate with people. 65% of people actually support this kind of action from the government, while other actions are not so quite determined. For instance, there were for a few days internet shutdown, total or like temporarily in the Almaty region and in the whole country. And there are, interestingly, 44% don't approve that because as we see and from other interviews, from other like reactions, they didn't like that. They didn't know what happened actually, what's going on at that time. They couldn't communicate with their families, friends, etc. On the other hand, 43%, like almost similar, approve, and it might be explained that it was kind of caused that people didn't were kind of ready to this kind of non-violent action from the government in order to stop the violence on the streets. Another like kind of similar distribution of answer we have on the violent dispersal protesters that actually happened in the early days, especially in Almaty. And interestingly, but like sadly, we see that 42% actually were kind of ready to approve those actions instead of 37 on the other hand who didn't. Quite opposite picture is about entry of CSTO troops. In Russian, it's ODKB, the treaty between Russia, Armenia, and Kazakhstan and other countries when they entered and sent here their troops. And like 44% didn't approve of those actions. And again, we see that it's kind of caused by the fear from the people. It came not from the survey, but from other observations that this fear and disapproval was kind of from the fear that maybe those troops will stay in the country, maybe they will kind of make us in debt in front of the Russia, etc. This was especially prominent a month later, like 2 months later, when the Ukrainian war has started, and people were kind of afraid that might be Kazakhstani troops also sending there to fight for Russia position. Another two last options that we see here is kind of actually have this definite position of the people. 71 and 72% of people didn't approve violence. For instance, when Tokayev has stated that gave an order that it was okay to shoot people without warning if they won't comply to return to the homes on the streets. And when afterwards there were kind of lots of cases of torture of detainees, which will be explained in more detail by our last guest speaker, Yevgeniy Zhovtis. Those two actions kind of have total disapproval from the society. And what it gave us, it gives that in the future, hopefully not, but still, government should see what are the different kind of levels of disapproval and what could be used, what should not be used. So let's move on the next question is, who is responsible for the tragedy? We know, as Karolgash mentioned, there were like 238 deaths count of people among citizens mostly. And we asked people, who do you think is responsible? Who would you blame on that? And actually, again, we don't see any prominent like answers that kind of win all others. We see that there are actually three of them, kind of similar have distribution and share of approval and answers from the people. Is their country leaders, like president, others, their citizens, like on the other side, people who say that they are kind of should blame themselves because of the death toll and all the violence that happened later. And also the second option, difficult to answer. There is a lot of people who don't know how to answer what happened and whom to blame. Law enforcement and governments actually have really low number of people who think that they are blamed ones. And we tend to believe that it mostly because people know that those agencies kind of doing just their orders from the country leaders, from their higher ranking people. And one of the last questions that I want to show you here is, so a year later, we had official version that it was a political provocation prepared for a year. And we asked people, do you trust this version? And we see that almost half of the population don't trust it at all, raises distrustful, while only about 30% in some sense are ready to trust it. And again, a high number of people who find it difficult to answer this question. And what we have in the end, we have that there are three main positions: skeptical, loyal, and apolitical among citizens. And yeah, I need to mention that it's not kind of perfect distribution of them, and they might kind of intersect in some cases, but still, people who are skeptical of the official version of the government, who don't support them and trust them, loyal people who actually believe all the government had said and prove their actions, and apolitical who don't know anything, who are not ready to answer and not ready to blame or judge or approve government or disapprove government action. And yeah, what we have in the end of the survey, we see that a year later, and maybe still, there is still no agreement, no consensus among population of what happened. We know that there are three main groups with opposing views, and maybe government should learn on these answers, what kind of on their communication, on their transparency, how it should have managed this kind of event. So that's it on my side. Thank you. Let's move on to the Camila and Derek.
Thank you, Modi. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Odiyar. It was very good to see the numbers of what narratives people actually believe. And yes, Camila, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. The study, the results of which we want to present further, was inspired by our desire to snapshot the reality and the understanding of the events in the moment, because we were concerned with the possibility that the January events could be later reframed or renamed, their agenda could be shifted, and even now we are witnessing this, we can be confused later and eventually forget how it was. So this is what was our main idea why we need to conduct this research. The study was initiated and conducted by PaperLab themselves from February to May 2022. Our team was looking for and recruiting for respondents themselves. So taking into account the sensitivity of the topic, it was not very easy. And there is also a consequent limitation of our study. Please, next slide. Our respondents are from our surroundings, we can say from our bubble, and they possess certain characteristics that may differ from other participants of the protest. We understand that, but at the same time, we consider that even their point of view could show us that there was really many more narratives and many more motivations that we are told by our government. And most of our respondents are from different cities from Kazakhstan. They are not only from Almaty, but mostly from Almaty, 6 of them, but also from Semey, Pavlodar, Aktau, Kostanay, and Ekibastuz. Their background is mostly mid-level professionals. Many of them are activists and journalists. They all had experience of no, not all had experience, but some of them had an experience of observing elections, and mostly voted for Kosanov as a protest candidate during the latest presidential elections. And this is also, this shows us what are the characteristics of these people. So the main questions of our study was who participated in this protest and why, who organized them, and was it organized at all, and what made people join the protest? Because in Kazakhstan, we usually don't join protests. We don't have that mass protests. And already during the protest, we noticed that there was already used a certain framing of the events. Framing is usually like a lens or a filter through which people make sense of the world. And it may be used in the process of knowing something for simplifying the reality and modeling it. But proposing one frame leads to the reduced understanding of the events. But we were provided with the framing that it was a terrorist attack and it was well organized. You can see the citation of President Tokayev during these days. And it is happening because in Astana, well, in Astana is a capital, no one believes that, or at least they act like they don't believe that a protest may happen or just because people really want to pronounce their will. So according to our study, however, January protests were only organized in Mangystau region. Maybe some of you know that people there have an experience of protesting, and we call it a culture of protesting, because they're usually coordinated by trade unions and because they have this real experience of participating in social labor protests, while except for apart from all other regions in Kazakhstan. And this time it was the case too. Our eyewitnesses that participated in our study saying about preparations, and that mechanism was working as clocks. Someone started gathering money, someone was preparing food, but the feeling, the atmosphere there was like during notice. And I want to like point out to this because people were feeling like there was a celebration. They were not trying to do it violently. And we were told many times, not only in Mangystau also, but later in other cities, that some suspicious people were trying to get a microphone, but they were stopped by people who were trying to organize all these protests. They were trying to prevent them from taking a microphone. In Almaty, like we had 6 respondents from Almaty, and only one of them told that she was informed about the protest in the chat of activists. But all others, they knew about the protest from news themselves. And some of them even joined the protest because they saw the march coming. And also in Almaty, they were many times telling, many different people telling that they felt like it was a celebration, like a demonstration, like a festive celebration. And now I understand, like later, like I was understanding that it was the beginning of January, and it was actually just the new year, and people really could have felt like it was a celebration, and like they could not have felt like it was something wrong to join this march. But even the woman who was informed through the chat, she told that there was no any coordination, but coordination happened only when the police already abandoned the city and they needed some guardians. Like there were some druzhinas, like militias from people, and they were like trying to patrol the city streets. In other regions, we didn't have any information about coordination. In some cities, Akimats provided some stages and equipment for the meeting, but nothing else. Next slide. Who participated in the protest? Again, according to the state framing, the participants were first terrorists and extremists, but then if they were not terrorists and extremists, they were looters, murderers, rapists. You can see the citations of President Tokayev also. But even later, when this framing was like shifted a bit, we were told that most of the protestants were defined as marginalized and poor youth that came from rural area and could not adapt to the cities, and so their main demands are accordingly like were connected to socioeconomic inequality. So we see here the labeling theory in work. When someone is put the label on, they will not be listened and their arguments will be considered not sufficient. Like when you are labeled as a marginalized person, like you should not be listened to, right? Because like why do I am a smart person from Astana should listen to a marginalized person? But based on our interviews that we conducted and the stories of activists, we classified the participants into 4 groups. There were activists like who usually participate in different protests and even not protests but single pickets or they are social media activists. They usually participate in observation of elections, which is some kind of activism in Kazakhstan. Another group of participants are informed citizens. They are not usually participating in any political events except voting in elections, but they are rather informed. They listen to news, they know who is in power and everything. Another type of participants in protests were spectators. And like I remember clearly, like one very young boy, like he was telling, like I just heard there were protests and I just rushed there and I wanted to look at, and he was like in video game. He was trying to find something interesting, something really emotional, and he didn't want to participate in the protest, but to look at it. So it was some kind of spectator. Also, our I didn't put it on the slide. I don't remember why, but also our interviewees were telling about some other some other people who also participated. For example, they were telling about the retirees, like older people who were coming there, especially during the latest days, and they were trying to help and medical help, and they were trying to support, and they were also like, can we consider them as participants of the protest? But at least they were there. And there was the 4th group, which like we are paying attention to because of this state propaganda is aggressive participants. And many other our respondents actually were telling about them. They were telling that there were some people, some men, who were trying to distribute vodka and who were trying to get this microphone. I'm sorry. So we cannot say that there were no such people. There were, but we also cannot say that there were the only participants of this protest. And this is our main idea. And next slide, please. So what are the main motivations and what are the main demands of this protest? So why people participated? When we look at the portrait of participants that is produced by our officials, we see that there is a clear attempt to reduce the protest to inequality and discontent with socioeconomic issues. However, it is not so. People had many different motivations and reasons to take part in the protest. First of all, many protestants were charged emotionally, and we saw it during our interviews and in social media also. Like we all know that emotions could be very important motivation for action, especially for a protest, which is not stable, but people just could be triggered to go there. So there was an old trauma that was never lived through during all these years that we all know who live in Kazakhstan. We all know it is Zhanaozen 2011, during which there were the first violently suppressed protests in Kazakhstan, and we still don't know anything what was happening there, except from some activists who are trying to tell the truth, and sometimes they are even considered as political opponents, and they were persecuted and they were jailed, and we still don't know like about January events. We still don't know what happened there exactly. And this is why the sense of solidarity was the main there. Like people were saying, like, we wanted to show solidarity, to show support to Zhanaozen people who all again stood up because they are the only who are standing up in Kazakhstan. And we wanted to show support because we wanted to show there are many of us who are against this. And we are together with Zhanaozen. And what is interesting is that when Almaty people, they stood up with Zhanaozen people, but later when there was some information about police brutality in Almaty, later people in Semey, in Petropavlovsk, Pavlodar, Ekibastus, in many other cities, they also stood up in solidarity with Almaty people. And we cannot deny this was like the main emotion of this protest. But also there was such an emotion as interest. People were like really just attracted to something interesting going on, like something unusual in Kazakhstan. And some people were telling about the sense of belonging to a historical event. So as I told earlier, like in Kazakhstan, it is not usual to have mass protests, and usually it's considered something very judged a lot. Like you should not participate in a protest like at any point, at any well, you should not try to not participate in protests. Like if you are participating, then you are opposing the power. So when people saw that there are protests and there are mass protests and many cities are joining them, they felt like there's something of a historical event. And you see the quote of one of our respondents, and it was like it is very emotional, yes, but at the same time it really shows what people felt and why they really joined this protest this time. At the same time, what about demands? Like we were looking at these demands not only based on our interviews, but also on social media. Yes, at first they were like mostly socioeconomic, like first reducing gas prices. Well, this is why actually Zhanaozen protest began. But then like some people were trying to join them and join their own demands, like raising salaries, closing loans. These are our usual demands that people are trying to like put through. But then we also had many cases when people were saying about the change of political system, which was articulated through Shalket. I think that many media wrote about that, and when we were talking about this with our respondents, they were telling, like, people don't know how to articulate that they want a political change. So the only way is to say "shalket," because at least this is understandable. At least they know that something needs to be changed. So "shalket" is not about President Nazarbayev only, but it's also about him, but not only. And it was about the change of political system. Some were asking about Akim's resignation, and some of them about the release of political convicts, which were mostly connected to previous protests, as I told earlier. And next slide, yes. And I want to end my speech with some additional consideration. Like, in our opinion, if people had a real opportunity to translate and to declare their needs through other means, they would not use protest. Well, in Kazakhstan, if you are using protest, this means that this is the last chance you can change anything. So, in my opinion, okay, or in our opinion, we're saying that this was the lack of political opportunity. This was the lack to translate their needs through parliamentary requests or parliamentary decisions or through local government bodies or something else. So the only way was to participate in this protest. Yes, again, it was connected to the closeness of the political system. And what we also noticed is that it was the taste for collective action for the people who participated in this protest, because after this protest, we were all a bit concerned about how people would feel because of this framing, because of the protestants who being framed and labeled as murderers, rapists, and marginalized people, that maybe they would not ever want to participate in protests. But as we see now, it actually brought people together, and it united them. So they got some taste of collective action. And I'm giving the floor to Serik. Thank you.
Thank you, Camila, for shedding light on who the participants were, their motivations, and highlighting solidarity sentiments among them. And I think your presentation was so interesting that people even stopped asking questions in our chat. So I would encourage our attendees to keep asking questions, and we'll try to ask our speakers at the end. Serik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kalash. Hi, everyone. So this has been only 2 years as January events, tragic January events, and I think it's too early to make conclusions about the consequences of these protests. But nevertheless, I would like to share some my understanding how these protests, how these events impacted to our political dynamics. First of all, we observe how a political regime instrumentalized the narratives regarding January protests. Particularly, authorities are keen on pushing the narrative on an attempted seizure of power and an attack by terrorists and extremists. Framing the protests this way is a cornerstone for the regime stability on the current situation and in the future, because it justifies the use of weapons against the protesters and the killing of over 230 people. That's why the state is currently spending massive resources into promoting this narrative. In the last 2 years, huge number of documentaries, reports, articles, books have been released. Even in the Nazarbayev's latest book, which came out just last week, the former president repeats the narrative about radical opposition and extremists who attempted to seize the power. But as our survey showed, despite the government's efforts, a significant number of citizens don't buy the official story. And a significant number of citizens tend to see these protests as a grassroots mobilization. And I think that their regime's unfair court sentences against the participants of these events only strengthen the public skepticism about this official version. However, framing the January events as an attempted seizure of power and extremist attack has created conditions for further intensification of repression in Kazakhstan. All activists accused of organizing the January protest, as we know, received significant prison sentences, even though their guilt wasn't proven enough. Moreover, the detention of other political activists continues. For example, Marat Julambayev, a prominent runner, was sentenced to 7 years in prison. At the same time, general protests manifested the power of civic mobilization. As the participants of our interviews reported, for the first time in their lives, they were able to see that by uniting, they could influence the government. And we saw other citizens for the first time, and it was as people shared, unforgettable experience and feeling. Under current repressions against activists, I think that it's a manifestation of governments scared about the potential of civic mobilization. Current repressions, legislative changes, and decisions are aimed at tightening control over civil society. Overall, our research shows that the January events were primarily self-organized protests by the citizens themselves. And the main motivation, as Camila mentioned, was a desire for change and expressing solidarity with other protesters. So the main story of the January events isn't about the power struggle, but it's about confrontation between an authoritarian regime and civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Serek, for your reflections and conclusions. And Mr. Zhovtis, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I want to start with some interesting observation of two trials held this year and related to January events. Two people were sentenced for allegedly separately organizing January events. In April 2023, one of the leaders of democratic opposition, the leader of Unregistered Democratic Party of Kazakhstan, Jan-Bolat Mamay, was sentenced to 6 years of suspended term for allegedly organizing mass disorder during January events and to 6 years ban on public activity. The trial was open and, according to the assessment of independent observers, was obviously politically motivated and no substantial evidence of guilt was presented. Later, the same month, in the absolute secrecy and closed trial, the former prime minister and at that time of events, the chairman of the Committee on National Security, Karim Masimov, was sentenced to 18 years of imprisonment for allegedly high treason and attempt to forcibly seize the power during the same January events. Some other high-rank officials from the Committee on National Security were also found guilty and sentenced to long-term imprisonment. Keeping in mind that Mr. Masimov was a close ally of the former president, Mr. Nazarbayev, and served in the government for many years, and in his turn, Mr. Mamay was in opposition for many years, it is practically impossible to suppose that these two have any cooperation related to organizing these events. And there was no information about such cooperation disclosed in any of these trials. And it creates some confusion when you are trying to understand what happens and who was behind the event, if any. But this observation, in my view, reflects certain dualism in assessment of these events. On one hand, The event reflected the serious social problems, social disparity, and lack of justice. And according to the data of sociologist Ayman Jusupova, labor conflicts in Mangystau region, for example, where the event started, grew from 20 in 2017-2020 to 150 in 2021, right 1 year before the event started. Those who are interested could look into our analytical report, Labor Rights, Trade Unions, and 2022 January events in Kazakhstan. The events in the early days of 2022 in Zhanaozen serves as a trigger and reflects this dissatisfaction of population. Initially, in Mangystau region, the protest related to the rise of prices for liquefied gas, brought together workers, representatives of vulnerable groups, and other people. Then civil activists and political opposition joined the protests, and political demands were put forward, including release of political prisoners and calls to limit the influence of former president and his family on politics and economy in Kazakhstan. Practically all protests initially were absolutely peaceful, but already considered by the authorities unlawful because of very restrictive and repressive legislation on peaceful assemblies. And in some regions, including Almaty, police start to act as usual, detaining peaceful protesters and cracking down on civil activists. In some regions of Kazakhstan, the protests were joined by marginalized youth people who came to big cities from small villages and auls looking for jobs and sources of income. This group used to be more aggressive, and situation in some cities starts to go out of control and turn violent. But this is on one hand. On the other hand, the clan groups and part of the elite close to the former president, especially in the south of the country, were very concerned by transfer of power from Mr. Nazarbayev to Mr. Tokayev. In spite of the fact that former president at that time still kept a lot of authority as the chair of the Kazakhstan Security Council, as the chair of the ruling party Nur Otan, and his status was fixed by constitutional provisions and special law on first president, it was clear that slowly the real power is going to a new president more and more. And as the former president built up a system, as I called it, of personal guarantees, because the economic transition of 90s make a lot of people from the elite very rich, but their wealth was vulnerable due to sometimes lack of legality and legitimacy, these clan groups saw a threat in transition of power and disappearing guarantees. And it looks like the initial phase of January events provided them an opportunity and was used to send the messages to new president that their interests should be taken into account through organizing some violence and showing that the central authorities are not controlling the situation in some regions. Of course, it's only my assumptions, which could be either supported or refuted if there will be independent international investigation, which human rights defenders, including myself and civil activists, were calling for at least or at least Masimov's trial be open. But it did not happen. And we still have no clarity, except the version of 20,000 terrorists was definitely thrown out. Finally, in mid-January, right after the events, a group of human rights organizations and experts established a human rights alliance for fundamental rights, trying to address the issues of violations of human rights as the right to life, freedom from torture and cruel treatment, right to free and fair trial, and other rights. The alliance conducted a monitoring of trials of civic activists and law enforcement officers tried in relation to January events. We published several monitoring reports, including the report on the rights of detainees, jointly with the coalition of Kazakhstani NGOs against torture report on torture, the report Shoot to Kill, and now we are drafting the monitoring report on the rights to free and fair trial. These reports provides a lot of data about the grave violations of these rights. I could mention that we have a lot of evidence of the violations of the right to personal freedom and the inviolability of the person. The problems with the torture, lack of access to lawyers, problems with the right to call, problems with the right to be to be detained or to be held in the facilities under the government control, and so on and so on and so on. All these reports provide you a lot of information about that. But the key problem is that the government, I don't know on what reason, don't want to go after the perpetrators to the extent how these crimes were committed. And we still are looking at the number of trials against the civic activists, which Serik already mentioned. A lot of trials against of peaceful protesters who took part in these events. There are, of course, some trials against law enforcement, and some members of the security and the police were tried and sentenced to long term of imprisonment, but some were acquitted, like in the case of the 4-year-old girl who was killed accidentally in these events. I think that we still do not have clarity in the, let's say, so the events in different regions, how they happen and so on. And we will not have, until we will not have real independent investigation, we still are not satisfied with the results of the bringing to justice the perpetrators of torture. We have the problems with the compensation of those who were killed during the events. And finally, the causes of the events have not, from my point of view, addressed properly. And again, I'm talking about social problems, social disparity, and lack of justice. Thank you. I'm ready to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Zhovtis. So since you just talked about human rights, I will start with you. The latest question is, activists in Kazakhstan constantly face illegal detentions, torture, and unjustified fines. How to deal with this? This is probably a very big question.
It's a very difficult question, but I will try to answer as short as possible. That we're dealing with an authoritarian state. We have to be clear with that. It's not a democratic country. Look at all ratings provided with the Economist Intelligence Unit or by Freedom House and so on. We do not still have independent judiciary where you could try to defend your rights and so on. We still have the institutions, police, KGB Light, as I called our Committee on Security, General Prosecutor's Office, all these bodies, judiciary in general, they are keeping still Soviet institutional memory. They're still working the same way, politically instructed or politically controlled, with the same type of attitude. And until these institutions will be not reformed, it's very difficult to expect any real systemic changes in that regard. Yes, in certain cases, we could raise this issue. We could bring it to the public, in the public domain. We could, let's say, use information or political, legal instruments to address the issue. But it's in certain single cases. In general, the whole system have to be politically reformed and institutionally. Because finally, look at our neighbors in the post-Soviet space, including Ukraine or Moldova, how difficult, even in the countries where you have the change of the elite, to reform these institutions. And we still do not have the change of the elite, and we have, unfortunately, the same institutions in place.
Thank you, Mr. Zhovtis. The question is for all panelists, if you're able to provide an update on the case of Karim Masimov and the factual circumstances that led to his arrest and detention for alleged treason. And how is this case presently viewed by the Kazakh elite? Does anyone have an answer to this?
Probably I will start. It's very easy for me to start this because it's the case similar to a number of cases where the higher rank officials or the elite were tried. The problem with this case is that it was closed trial. We don't know really what evidence was brought, how it was proved, his guilt was proved, and so on. We know only that he was sentenced to 18 years of imprisonment, that that in the Court of Appeal slightly the regime of facility was slightly eased, but in general, it is perceived mostly as the inter-elite clash, where the person responded for the events in a closed trial where we don't know whether really he committed and what he committed. That's, but again, Mr. Massimo was the prime minister, Mr. Massimo was the head of this Committee on National Security, and he fall the victim of the system which he was strengthening.
Thank you. So the next question is to Audiar, our first speaker. Was there any analysis of opinions of other ethnic groups, like Koreans, Uzbeks, and others? And what reasons did other groups voice? And can it outline the national identity related issues?
Yeah, so first of all, among respondents, there are like, as far as I remember, 14% of other ethnicities apart from Kazakhs and Russians, which is quite representative of the population number. So we had asked them, and while doing analysis, most of the time there were no like huge discrepancies from the average what was there. But in some cases, minority, like ethnic minorities, had this kind of interesting insights. For instance, in the question, do you support kind of entrance of these TS or the KB troops, like TSKP, as I remember, they are more keen to approve that. For instance, unlike Kazakhs, who like mostly didn't approve this kind of action. Apart from that, I don't recall any other cases of kind of significant differences among ethnic minorities. But if interesting, we have the survey result published on our website, and there might be more intel on that. So I could not comment on national identity issues here at the moment because our survey didn't cover that at that point, and I don't want to just say subjective opinion on that. And also, just next question I have, I see on ethnic composition of protesters and rioters. I think it's simple. We don't have like precise number, unless maybe Camila Seri could also comment on that.
Yeah, we also don't have such numbers because it was not like we barely have the number of protesters themselves, like as a whole in other cities and locations. So yes, we don't have this ethnic composition, unfortunately.
Thank you. And following up on that, in your report, it says that the main split in support, in the level of support, was along the ethnic lines. Like Russians were more supportive of CSTO troops coming, and Kazakhs were less supportive. Do you have any explanation to that other than maybe the influence of Russian propaganda?
Yeah, so first of all, yeah, you're right. It might be the case of Russian propaganda, and that like in population, most of our Russian citizens, like our Kazakh citizens of Russian ethnicity, live in the northern part of Kazakhstan, so they are like more, how'd say, covered like maybe by this Russian propaganda. Also, we have the case that Russian ethnicities and Slavic ethnicities are more like older on average than the younger one. So sometimes it's hard to differentiate where is it's the case of ethnicity when it's the case of like age differences. Because for instance, like kind of common knowledge that young people are more apolitical. They don't like don't read much about politics, while the older generations like try to see what's going on there. They watch television a lot, etc. So it's hard to differentiate the reasons why it's happening, this kind of differences.
Oh, thank you. If anyone else wants to answer questions that we ask, you are free to speak. So another question from our audience is, I would like to ask about views in the media and among the population regarding the invitation of Russian-led CSTO. I guess here the focus is on media, since we already talked a little bit about the general population.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question because I was... I wanted to add actually to the answer of Aldiar about this.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the issue is not only about the ethnicity, but also generation, not just age, but generation. People from older generations, they are more connected to Soviet Union, and Russia is the continuation of Soviet Union. And like they sometimes, even Kazakhs of older generations, they sometimes feel like Russia is not a different country, is a separate country. They consider it as our country, like, and usually we say, like, for example, in football or like in some sport games, in other events, like we're saying, like, we are winning there because, like, though the winning country is Russia. So I mean, there are such sentiments here in Kazakhstan, and especially in some parts of the country. Yes, mostly in the closer regions to Russia. Yes.
Thank you, Camila. So the question I read before was about the views regarding the invitation of Russian-led CSTO troops and in the media and among the population. If anyone would like to answer that.
Probably I will add something to what was already said, that first of all, of course, it's not the result of any kind of sociological polls, but it looks like that the vast majority of protesters were of Kazakh origin, especially in the west, south, and partly east of the country. Secondly, and it could be proven that in the more so-called Russian populated areas like northern Kazakhstan, so the events didn't took place, or they are very on the very small scale. This is number one. Number two, I think that, of course, the perception of the CSTO forces to be brought to Kazakhstan, there were some concerns in the beginning that they will stay for a longer time. And my first comment on that regard was that if these forces will be withdrawn in 10 days, 2 weeks, then they will not damage too much the political situation or the image of Mr. Tokayev and so on. If they will stay longer, it will create certain kind of problems. I think that these forces were brought not to the extent to curb the, let's say, the violence and so on. They were not involved, at least what I know, in the events as such. This was my looking as more like a resource to send some messages to some elite groups or something like that, there are certain resources to keep or to bring the situation to stability rather than to be involved in clashes or some kind of operations on the ground. But in general, I agree with my colleagues that in the Russian-speaking regions or more old population, they look at these forces like stabilizing force, and at Russia, because of the Russian dominance on the informational in the information space of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Mr. Zhovtis. I think people are very interested in ethnic relationships or interests.
And about the question about the CSTO and the perception in media and showing, as far as I remember, we had also like media analysis, but what we saw that there were some more like, you know, we have some media that are mostly state funded, and they usually produce what is needed. And yes, they sometimes react to people's discontent. If people show that they don't like that CSTO is staying here, then they're trying to explain, they're trying to inform, and they were trying to. But the difference was between the Russian language media and Kazakh language media. Kazakh language media, they allowed them, maybe some of them were like privately sourced, privately funded, but we saw that there was a difference in perception of CSTO staying here. And yes, we can say that some nationalists, they were like trying to show that there's something more than just staying there, than just protecting people, than just peaceful how does it say, миротворческая миссия, да, peacemaking mission, but they were trying to show that there is a risk. There is a risk that Russia will take over Kazakhstan and like put their own president or something like that. But I'm not laughing at these narratives. I mean, I'm laughing at the whole situation that it could have been so, right? So but Russian language media, they are usually like mostly state funded, so they were just trying to calm people down. They were trying to explain, no, they were just to protect these buildings. They are just standing there. They don't shoot. They don't touch anyone, and they were even like photos of that. And yeah, but I think that probably the speed with how much, how soon the CSTO troops were removed from Kazakhstan, it was actually affected by people's reaction, because like we really had this reaction in Kazakhstan, and I'm a bit proud of it.
One more comment on CSTO troops. We were surprised to get these numbers. So 44% of citizens they were against of their entry. And I think that war in Ukraine also could impact on that, because after this war, CSTO, I think in public perception was strongly linked with Russian aggression. And that's why it was just a symbol of military attack, and had people perceived this more negatively, because we don't have evidences that all CSTO troops took part in crackdown of protesters. They just entered and left country during 10 days, and we expected that it will be more positive perception, but no, people didn't like this, and it's good news.
Thank you, Serek. So another question from our audience is about social and political status of other ethnic groups, especially Uyghurs in Nazarbayev's time and Tokayev's time. I guess it's about their political views and standings. If you have any observations or data on that.
May I please just, we don't have research on that. And I am, as a representative of Kazakh ethnicity, I cannot say for people of other ethnicities, right? Like what their experience is like. What we see is that we are trying to make it look like we are all living in peace, and we are all really in friendship with each other, like and we don't have discrimination, or at least I've never heard about this. I mean, and this is just because I'm a Kazakh, so maybe this is why I don't know about it. But I don't think that the issue with Masimov has something to do with his ethnicity. You know, because if we actually assume this, then he could never become that powerful in the first place. Like, he would not be prime minister. He would not be the KNB head. You know, because this is national security, and like no one could ever allow him to be the head of this state service if he was like considered inferior, or he was considered a potential traitor or something. So in my opinion, it is not this case. But at the same time, I cannot tell you about the real situation. As far as I know, like I have a friend of mine. She has a research. She conducts a research about Uzbek community in Kazakhstan, and like she says that when she's trying to conduct this research, she just asks people from her own community, like, how do you feel? What is your identity? How do you feel as an Uzbek in Kazakhstan? And the moment she asked them, this question, they are shutting down and they are like just using these ideologies that we're using, like we all live in peace here, like 130 people, different ethnicities are living here and everything. I mean, this shows something. So, but at the same time, we cannot just assume, we need to know, right? And so we don't know that. So, but Masimov case is not further.
Thank you, Camila. The next question, I think, is very interesting for you as researchers. What kind of future research should be done in order to understand January events better? I think this person is mostly interested in what primary sources would you need? Like, can be archives, interviews.
So let me start. Well, as far as I know, there are already like at least Mr. Zhovtis already told that there are so many reports they wrote, and we have our report and two types of report already. And like I was contacted here that some people are also conducting their research, their survey. So I mean, I think that we already like doing, and the good thing is that we started early. Before it started to being forgotten, and because we had this with Zhanaozian, and this was the problem, and now we are trying to get this information from like just from primary sources, from people, and Mr. Zhovtis called that he has something like the stage by stage, like day by day description of what happened in Zhanaozian and then in Aktau. I mean, this is the big source of information, and I'm really glad that we have that. I don't believe that KNB will ever let us look at what really happened, even in 25 years. So I think that if someone is interested in this topic, like we could like gather this info, collect this information, like everyone on their own level, or you can just join people who already do this, and like be like the hands, another pair of hands who is helping there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Serek, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I agree with Camila. So far, a lot of work was done. For example, human defenders, Bakhtan Torigozhin, Yevgeniy Zhovtis, and their colleagues, they collected each cases of killed people and analyzed them. And as far as I know, this data is available for research, for study as well. I think a very valuable source of information is video and evidences in social media which was disseminated a lot, and I think that we can analyze this additionally and to get more understanding what was happening in different cities. In terms of our research, we would like to expand of our informants and to interview people from other cities and with other background, because as Camila mentioned, we assume that our respondents, our informants were mostly from our bubble, informational bubble, but we hope that next year we can achieve other less available categories of informants and to publish a report. Yeah, we didn't mention our report on interviews, based on interviews, is not published yet because we're still analyzing data and trying to make it better. But next year it will be able. Thanks.
Thank you, Serek. I think the video is a little pausing. Yes, Mr. Zhovtis.
Yes, I want to add something to what Cedric said. First of all, some of the reports which we published are in English as well. They're in Kazakh, Russian, and English, that they could be shared and could be used. Secondly, of course, we are not the researchers and we are not following the strict sociological rules and so on, but at the same time, the results of our analysis of information we collected, for example, when we prepared the report on detainees, rights of detainees, it shows the pattern practically in all regions of the country. There is no serious differences when related to the torture or violation of the rights of detainees and so on and so on. This is number one. Number two, when we established our Human Rights Alliance, we tried to do different things. We try, first of all, to provide legal aid to those who were detained, civil activists, and so on, in the cases of torture as well. But at the same time, the group, as Cedric already mentioned, group of Bakhajan Tarigozhina used volunteers in many regions trying to collect first-hand information from the witnesses, from the people who were involved. At the same time, we organized several events with the victims of torture who were testifying, and we recorded that, and we have this information as well. We know that the International Youth Service is also preparing their report on the access to information during the events. That there is a lot of pieces from different groups. The group of International Legal Initiative, Ayna Sharmanbayeva, they collected all the information about the cases. Also, there was cases who were killed during these events. That probably, and we are trying to collect all these, keeping it outside of the country on the web resource and so on. And I hope that all this information sooner or later could be analyzed and could be collected together, could be treated properly, and will provide at least some, let's say, some information, some overview of the whole situation. But again, that's why we were calling from the beginning in January 2022 for this international or hybrid commission, investigation commission to go into the events, because unfortunately the whole picture is not so clear. We have the pieces, but we don't have the whole picture. Thanks.
Thank you. I will read a couple of questions from our chat because some speakers are responding in the chat, but this will not be seen in our recording and on our YouTube channel. So one of the questions is for Aldiyar. Do you have information on respondents' answers based on regions?
So yeah, as I answered in the chat, we have this data and we did analyze the answers, how they distribute and how they differ among them. But we need to mention that from the methodological side of view, we could not state definitely that it's kind of representative of the region itself. So we tried to avoid it and not to publish or not to share it currently. So it's hard to say how it differs. But from what I have seen in most cases, on most of the answers, they have similar patterns. We have differences among the rural-urban distribution, which is also interesting. And I mentioned it, I believe, in the presentation in some places.
Thank you. The next question is about, I guess it's also to all the speakers. Can you name the pros and cons of Kazakhstan's withdrawal from CSTO? Or ODKB in Russian? No opinions.
I don't think it's the scope of our competence or expertise.
Yes, I understand.
It's politological question. It's the question of the geopolitical question rather than politological. On one hand, I do not think that there is any kind of use in this organization, and I have seen the Armenian, let's say, so opposition in certain way, how the CSTO is reacting or what happens. On the other hand, I think Kazakhstan is geopolitically, it's obvious, in a very difficult position, being trapped between Russia and China, having the 7,000 kilometers borderline with China, with Russia. That's to a certain extent, participation in the CSTO is trying to, let's say so, to put forward this multi-vectoral policy in a very difficult geopolitical environment. That's, for me, it's not the question whether it is pro or contra from withdrawal, it's how to look at the whole situation in its dynamics and diversity in that regard. That's why it's very difficult to assess that, because the Kazakh authorities will be driven by the geopolitical considerations and concerns.
Thank you. I would like to also join this question that was asked in the chat, especially given all the persecutions of activists in Kazakhstan. Do you think it is possible that the January events will be repeated, given the current tense situation in the country?
I can start to answer this question based on the surveys that we had. We actually, one of the 12 questions was, how do you assess the probability of repeating those events? And actually it was that like around 30% of respondents say that it's kind of 50-50. 4% said that it's kind of actually very likely, and 10% said it's likely. Like remaining were about 40% who said that it's almost zero, 20% said it's hard to say. So what we see from this, that actually there are still people who believe that it might be repeated. But we need to mention again, to remind listeners that this data came from a year ago. So current situation, current distribution of answer might be totally different. Like we don't know, it might be higher, it might be lower. Also, I just wanted to include here, so when we analyze this question, how people answered, we see that actually men, there were most, like the people who said that it's very likely to repeat those events were mostly men, for instance, and mostly the people who don't trust official version at all. So I think it's kind of interesting and important moment.
Well, I wanted to add that, well, according to my observations, like I cannot say that there was a study, but according to my observations, after the war in Ukraine started, we have some kind of mobilization, like positive mobilization of people in Kazakhstan, and like we see the manifestations of decolonization ideas, and that we need to like, and also we see that many, when we are talking about these migrants from Russia who were coming to Kazakhstan and to other Central Asian countries, like at some point we like felt like now Kazakhstan is like a safe harbor, and I think that before the war in Ukraine, we could say that these protests could have repeated, but after that, and especially after all this time, and you know, in Kazakhstan, we're usually saying, you know, we have this saying, like at least it's not like in Tajikistan, like when there was a civic war, or at least it's not like in Ukraine when there was Maidan. I mean, our people are really afraid of really violent conflicts, and I think that when we are again exposed to them, and we see them every day, and we like watch them, observe them, like I think that we will again try to save the peace with all possible measures. And I'm not telling about the authorities now, I'm telling about ordinary people too, like that. I think that they have this feeling now, but maybe it's my I mean, it's my bias.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll ask the last question. We know that people of all ages participated in the protests, and often there is this popular opinion that young people nowadays are apolitical. They're very passive. So I would like to ask you, especially probably Camila and Sergey as sociologists, how would you describe the political views or activity of young people in Kazakhstan? Especially, I know we have a lot of youth grassroots organizations and movements, and a wide network that is called Youth Information Network of Kazakhstan, MISK. So could you comment on political activity of young people in Kazakhstan?
Well, it's actually not only Kazakhstan topic. Well, in many countries, in most countries of the world, they're saying and keep saying that youth is less political than their previous generations, and they base these assumptions on the votes, voting behavior of youth. But many researchers now come to conclusion that political behavior or political participation cannot be limited to only voting behavior. So yes, I would agree with them. Like, I'm one of such like researchers, or like just people who are backing this idea that young people, they are not politically they are not apolitical. They just try to participate differently, and maybe they are showing that they don't believe in these traditional tools, because they are all like possessed by older generations, and they won't give them these tools, maybe because of that, but mostly because maybe they see that these grassroots initiatives, they are more efficient, and you can see the result right upfront. Like, you are doing something and you see the result of something, not like in usual, like in traditional politics, right? You need to contest there for ideas, you need to participate in parliament, you need to back some interest groups and lobby them and this and that, and then you need to come to government, and maybe your policy will be sometimes in some form used, but yeah, maybe. So I believe that our young people, they actually participate, and one way of participating is also observing the elections, which I really consider the type of activism, because independent observers like MISK and like Yerkin Dokhanatov, they are not they are usually considered as opposing the authorities, and so it really needs to like, you need to have a stamina to be an observer. So I think that it's also a type of activism, and so I think that they are participating actually.
I just want to ask, offer each speaker to say something like concluding remarks, if you'd like to.
I want to add something to what was said already about the possibility of the event to be repeated. I do not believe that these events could be repeated, because these events reflect the several factors which were involved, including the events in Zhenozhen, including the some inter-elite clashes and so on. But at the same time, I could not exclude the possibility that some events could happen locally in certain areas, because the authorities are not providing any kind of space and channels for any meaningful political participation. They are not allowing political parties to be registered. They are cracking down on absolutely peaceful political opposition, including Marat Jahanbayev, who was already mentioned, journalist Duman Mohamed Karim, Aigerim Pleujan, and so on and so on and so on. They are not providing any space for normal political dialogue, for normal political discussion, to solve the problems which exist and which will still we will still face them. The authorities think that they will keep everything under the control. They have some money and some means, financial means, to keep the things if they will rights like the what happens in 2022. But in general, it's still the very close system, the system which do not allow normal political messages to be heard and to be implemented. And the youth understand that. The youth is not only apolitical as such, but they are trying to use other forms. They became, and the gender event showed that, and after that, the youth starts to be more involved in public activity, say, to try to consolidate and coordinate certain actions, even if it's not purely political path. But again, the system itself, the institutions at place, if there will be not political reform, they will create inevitably some space for certain turmoil of certain kind of events. Maybe not generally, but in other forms. We see some independent trade unions raising the issues. We see these tragic events in Karaganda and so on. All these things could bring some kind of turmoil because, again, there is no normal political space, no space for people to be involved in decision making, and this is the problem of any authoritarian regime, and Kazakhstan is not the exclusion.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, Cedric, you're back. Maybe you can try again.
So yeah, I think that if to answer the question about the repetition of January events, it's a main question of Kazakhstan political development for future next years. And if to observe the following dynamics and take into account that all factors, with combination of factors, which which led to January protests, still remain in Kazakhstan. And the most expecting transformation of situation, transformation of political system, and to make to let citizens participate in elections, to openly express their opinions, and this conflict between changed society, which active and more involved, and the political system, which is still conservative and autocratic, is main systematic conflict, which will lead to the next protest mobilization in the future, I guess. And that's why, yeah, I think that we still have a very hard situation, and we now see how activists are arrested, and we don't see any fair investigation of cases of murders and injustice courts, and we don't have opportunity to conduct independent and transparent investigations of January events. And all these factors, all these circumstances, I think, can be fuel for next dissatisfaction and protest mobilization. Thanks.
Thank you, Cedric. Camila and Audiyar, any final remarks?
So first of all, I want to thank you, Central Asia Program, for giving us this platform to share our research, our results and insights that we have, because I think it's important to not only do it for our website or our say small community, but share with people in Kazakhstan, people outside of Kazakhstan. And secondly, yeah, this kind of events, even though there are many other things bad, like in Kazakhstan or outside, like war is happening, it shouldn't be the reason to forget about this kind of big tragic moments. It's something that needs to be studied. It's something needs to be in Russian, like прожитый, проработанный, something to work on. in order not to let it happen again in the tragic way. But on the other hand, it should be like lesson for government that it's important to move and be more democratic and to communicate with people. So that's the first, like, most important thing, which will like not happen. Let not happen this kind of event.
Thank you.
Yeah, and in response to Mr. Zhovtis and Serik, I think that though, yes, the situation stays the same and like activists are being prosecuted, we see it, but I must say that there is a minority, like too few people who are actually observing the situation, like actually included and in this discussion, or like they're at least seeing this. And when you don't see this, and when you don't look for this information, you never get it. And I think that most of Kazakhstani people, they don't know anything about these activists and what happened to them after the January events. And I mean, am I a pessimist or am I an optimist? I don't know in this situation, but I mean, this is why I actually don't think that this scale mobilization could happen. Well, at least this like 2 years or like 3 years, because like, well, people really, they are really afraid of what happened in Ukraine, and they're really like mobilized. And it's called mobilization around the flag, but it usually happens in the country which is in war. But like we're just watching there, we're sitting here and watching this, and like we're also mobilized around our authorities. And people would prefer to believe, and they don't have that high level of mistrust to our public bodies. Like mostly they do what they're doing, like we have quite a strong government, quite a strong state, and like people would rather gather around it than like try to change the political system, which sounds very distant to them, and they don't believe in it. Yes, so I don't think that there is a high possibility of the repetition, though. Yes, like local conflicts, local labor conflicts could happen, but they were happening all the time and during all these years. So, well, I hope we will never face such events again, because not because I don't want people to protest and show their voice and raise their voice, but because I don't want it to translate in these violent events. And yes, it happened not because of people who actually went to the streets, but still, yes. So these are my concluding remarks.
Thank you, Camila. Thank you, everyone, all our amazing speakers, for this very interesting and deep discussion, and to all our audience that attended. And thank you for dedicating your evening in Kazakhstan, because it is morning here where Central Asia program is based. And thank you for accommodating us. And I hope we'll see you in future events. Thank you, everyone.